devil's couple, haunted by lost love and betrayal. In the dead of night, a sinister presence fills the household of Mr. Chang, an influential and wealthy village chief, infamous for his ruthless ways. His peaceful sleep is shattered by a haunting disturbance, a desperate knocking, and a voice calling him father. As the figure of a woman, his long-deceased daughter, materializes outside. The family cat, hissing with fear, confirms a lurking presence is not of this world. Frightened but in denial, Mr. Chang goes back to bed, dismissing his wife's warnings as nonsense, only for a new round of terror to strike again with spectral clarity. Their tormented daughter, wrongfully murdered by her own family for loving a poor villager, has returned for vengeance. One by one, the house's secrets unravel in a series of increasingly horrifying events, as the spirit of Chang's daughter and her unborn child exact their terrifying justice. This family's sins are laid bare, leaving a grim reminder of fate's retribution for their cruelty. As dawn finally arrives, Mr. Chang, his power stripped and his family reduced to ghosts, contemplates the heavy price of his heartless pride and deeds. He yearns for forgiveness, but his only solace lies in a bitter, eternal reunion with the spirits of those he wronged. Part 1. The Cold Return. In the heart of a stormy night, an oppressive silence filled the grand but cold mansion of Mr. Chang Hargrove, a once powerful village chief whose pride and influence stretched far and wide. The wind howled outside, clawing at the walls like desperate hands. Thunder boomed, and each flash of lightning briefly illuminated the dark rooms, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. All was dark and still within, save for the gentle sound of his wife Evelyn's shallow breaths as she lay beside him, restless. Chang lay fast asleep, his chest rising and falling with the deep, untroubled rhythm of a man who believed himself untouchable, safe from the terrors that lurked in the world beyond. For years he had built his reputation and ruled his household with an iron fist, allowing no dissent, no challenges, and certainly no superstitious nonsense. But tonight, something sinister loomed in the corners of his world, waiting. But suddenly a sound pierced the storm outside, a soft, mournful voice, faint at first but unmistakable. Father, it was no more than a whisper, a delicate but heart-wrenching murmur, carried by the wind, just enough to make Evelyn's eyes snap open. She lay still, unsure if she had heard it, or if it was just the echo of a forgotten dream. Her heart raced as the voice came again, clearer this time, filled with sorrow and longing. Father, let me in. Father, she turned to Chang, her hand gripping his shoulder, trembling. Chang, she whispered urgently, shaking him with a touch that betrayed her terror. Wake up, someone is outside. Chang groaned and brushed her hand away, his irritation breaking through his drowsiness. What nonsense are you talking about, Evelyn? It's just the storm, he muttered, already turning his back to her. But Evelyn couldn't ignore the chills running up her spine, nor the voice that now seemed to press itself against the very walls of their bedroom, whispering its eerie message into the room. Chang, Evelyn persisted, her voice a mix of pleading and terror. Please, listen, I hear her who, Evelyn, he snapped, his patience running thin. He was in no mood for her tales. It's just a storm. Stop imagining things. But she couldn't stop, couldn't shake the sensation that the voice was all too familiar. It sounded like Teresa Chang's only daughter, their precious child who had left them under tragic circumstances. And yet it couldn't be her. It had been more than a year since Tiesa's untimely death. Her voice should not be ringing through the night. But the voice persisted, steady, unwavering. Father, the words slithered through the room like a chill, leaving an unmistakable weight in its wake. It was closer now, more insistent, carrying the sorrow and bitterness of a soul left unresolved. Evelyn felt tears prickling in her eyes as she whispered, it's her. Chang, still as Chang's jaw clenched as he sat up, glaring into the shadows as if daring them to defy him. Teresa is gone, Evelyn. You need to move on, he said, his voice like steel, trying to shatter the fragile, haunted air around them. There's nothing out there. Just then, a flash of lightning lit the room, spilling shadows into every corner, turning familiar shapes into menacing forms. Chang's breath hitched for a moment as he saw a figure standing just outside the window. Tall, thin and dripping wet, as if caught in the storm, she stood motionless, her face pale and her eyes fixed on him. Chang's stomach twisted as he saw her, Teresa, unmistakably, hauntingly. Evelyn's hand found his arm, gripping it tight, her own eyes locked on the figure at the window. Do you see her, Chang? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Tell me you see her. Chang opened his mouth to deny it, to insist it was an illusion brought on by the storm and her overly imaginative mind, but he couldn't form the words. Teresa's face was there, framed in the glass, her eyes hollow but filled with an emotion that was almost worse than anger. It was disappointment, sorrow, and an unrelenting accusation that seeped through the glass. Father, she whispered again, and though her voice was soft, it was like a blade that sliced through the air between them. Why did you let me die? Why did you turn me away? Chang swallowed, his mouth dry, his heart hammering as he stared at his daughter's ghostly form. Memories of their last encounter rushed back to him, the harsh words, the dismissal, the cold indifference with which he had shut her out of his life. It was all for family honor, he had told himself, to keep their reputation unsullied by her rebellious choices, but now, staring into her sorrowful, empty gaze, he felt a pang of guilt so deep it seemed to freeze his very soul. As he opened his mouth to speak, thunder roared, and the figure at the window disappeared in a flash. The room was silent once more, leaving only the sound of Evelyn's frightened breaths and the relentless patter of rain against the windows. Chang, Evelyn whispered, her voice quivering. She's come back. She's come back to seek something from us. She dared not say the word, but it lingered between them, vengeance. Chang gritted his teeth, forcing himself to snap out of the daze. He scowled, refusing to believe that anything supernatural could be happening in his home. Nonsense, he muttered. This is nothing but a figment of your imagination, Evelyn. Grief makes people see things that aren't there. But as he tried to dismiss it, he heard it again. The voice, softer but unmistakable, carrying from somewhere within the depths of the storm. Father Chang clenched his fists, his heart racing despite his best attempts to deny what he had seen and heard. His mind screamed at him to stop looking, to turn away, but he couldn't shake the feeling of his daughter's presence, her spirit, lingering on the edges of his consciousness like a shadow that refused to fade. The whispers continued, calling him over and over, filling the room, pressing into his skin, weaving through his mind like a relentless refrain. Chang could feel it now, the chill of the grave creeping up his spine, the heavy weight of all his unspoken regrets bearing down on him. Teresa's voice, haunting, sorrowful, echoed within him, each word a needle of despair and reproach. Father, I'm here. You let me die. Father. Evelyn clutched his hand, her face streaked with tears. We have to listen, Chang, she pleaded, her voice breaking. She's come for a reason. She needs us to hear her. But Chang tore his hand away, his face contorted in stubborn anger, though he could feel the cracks forming in his resolve. No, he shouted, his voice a mix of fear and defiance. There's nothing here. Just go back to sleep, Evelyn. There's no one outside. There's nothing to fear. Yet as he spoke, his voice trembled, his mind unable to shake the memory of Teresa's hollow gaze, of her voice filled with sorrow that only the dead could know. And even as he turned away, pulling the covers over himself, the whispers continued, growing louder, insistent, relentless. Father. Part 2. The First Encounter. The wind howled louder, and the air grew colder, as if winter itself had seeped into every corner of the Hargrove mansion. Chang's jaw clenched, his gaze focused on the window, where moments ago he had seen what he dared not believe: Teresa, his daughter, standing outside in the rain, her eyes hollow and accusing. His heart raced with the unease he refused to name, and he could feel Evelyn's trembling hands clutching his arm tighter, her breaths quick and shallow. Chang, Evelyn whispered, her voice thick with desperation. It's her. I know it's her. I can feel her. She's come back to us. Chang closed his eyes, trying to steady his breath. It's nothing but a storm. You're letting grief play tricks on your mind. She's gone, Evelyn. But the unease he felt in the pit of his stomach betrayed his words. The rain battered against the window, a relentless symphony of sharp taps, as though someone knew something was trying to break its way in. He had buried the memory of Teresa and the pain she had caused him, sealing it away behind the same walls that now enclosed him in this oppressive darkness. But tonight the past clawed its way back to him, relentless and cold. Then, as if in answer to his thoughts, the whispering started again, clearer, more insistent, yet still carrying the delicate undertone of sadness. Father, Mother, I'm here. Evelyn let out a small gasp, her fingers digging deeper into Chang's arm. Her eyes were wide, gleaming with tears as she looked to him, her voice choked and thick with sorrow. Chang, she sounds just like she did. When she left us, Chang's face hardened as he felt the words settle over him like a shroud. The memory surfaced against his will, a night not so different from this one. Months ago, when Teresa had stood in front of him, her tear-filled eyes begging for compassion. She had fallen in love with a young farmer named Nathaniel, a man whose family barely scraped by. Chang had refused her, had forbade her to see him, insisting she marry a suitor worthy of their family's name. But Teresa, spirited and defiant, had disobeyed, fleeing to be with Nathaniel in spite of her father's wrath. Days later, news had reached them. Teresa had died in a tragic accident on the river, her body found cold and lifeless, just days after she'd run away. Grief had torn through Evelyn, shattering her spirit, while Chang locked his pain behind anger and pride, refusing to utter her name again. Now, that same name echoed through their home, reverberating in the stillness like an accusation. Chang shook his head, his voice a low, urgent whisper, "This isn't real, Evelyn, it can't be." But Evelyn's gaze was fixed on the window, her breath catching as a soft, ghostly figure began to take form outside. It was faint at first, a pale outline against the darkness, but it grew more defined with each heartbeat, her hair streaming in wet, dark tendrils around her face, her eyes hollow and distant, fixed directly on her father. "Oh, Teresa," Evelyn's voice cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks. "My sweet girl." Chang's chest tightened as he looked upon his daughter's spectral face. She was both familiar and foreign, a tragic ghost of the girl who had once laughed in this very room, who had brought warmth to their lives. But now, she was only sorrow and shadows, her expression twisted with despair and bitterness. Father Teresa's voice floated through the storm, delicate yet chilling, laced with an anger he could not have imagined. "You turned me away. You refused my love. I had nowhere to go. Nowhere." Chang tried to swallow the lump in his throat, tried to muster words that would shatter the illusion before him. But Teresa's figure remained, translucent yet unmistakable, a vision of grief and accusation. Memories rushed at him, her tear-stained face, her trembling voice as she had begged him to let her choose her own path. And he had answered with coldness, with the unbending conviction that family honor was above all else. "Please leave us," he said, though his voice was no longer firm. It wavered, cracking under the weight of his guilt and fear. This isn't real. Teresa is gone," but his words seemed to ignite something in Teresa's spectral form. Her expression darkened, her pale lips curling into a sorrowful smile that twisted into something more menacing. She took a step closer to the window, her hollow gaze piercing through the glass, sending a chill down his spine. "I had nowhere to go. Because of you, Father," she whispered, her voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "You turned your back on me when I needed you most." Evelyn let out a choked sob, her hands flying to her mouth as she looked helplessly between Chang and their daughter's ghostly figure. She reached out a trembling hand, as though she could touch her, bring her back, bridge the chasm of death between them. "Teresa, forgive us. Forgive your father. He didn't understand," Evelyn whispered, pleading. Teresa's gaze shifted to her mother, softening for a moment. But as Chang caught her eye, her look turned cold again, dark with a pain that seemed endless. "Forgiveness," she said softly, her voice echoing through the room, carrying a weight that was almost unbearable. "What forgiveness is there for a man who abandons his daughter to die?" Chang flinched as though struck, the words hitting him with the force of a physical blow. His face drained of color, his jaw tightening as he tried to speak, but nothing came. The weight of her accusation pressed down on him, suffocating, undeniable. Teresa's form flickered, then solidified once more, closer now, her hand reaching out as though to touch the glass. Chang took an involuntary step back, his eyes wide with horror, feeling the walls of his home, his sanctuary, closing in around him. His breath came in short gasps, and he felt Evelyn's grip on his arm tighten, her nails digging into his skin as she held on to him, as though she feared he would be swept away by the tide of their daughter's vengeance. "You were supposed to protect me." Father Teresa's voice trembled, her face twisting with a sorrow too deep to name. "But you left me to suffer. You left me alone," Chang's voice finally returned, though it was barely more than a strangled whisper. "Teresa, I thought I was doing what was best for you, for our family," but the words sounded hollow even to him. His justifications, his pride, all felt meaningless in the face of his daughter's ghost, her sorrow bleeding through every word. Evelyn's sobs grew louder, and she fell to her knees, her face buried in her hands. "Please, don't hurt us, Teresa. We love you. I loved you. I still do." Teresa's eyes lingered on Evelyn, and for a fleeting moment her face softened, her hand hovering near the glass, as though she could feel her mother's anguish. But her gaze returned to Chang, hardened and cold, her voice like a knife. "I wanted nothing but love, Father. I wanted a life of my own. You took that from me, and now you will know what it is to feel the same loneliness, the same pain." Her form flickered, fading in and out with the storm, her eyes locked on her father's with a stare so intense it felt as though it could pierce through his very soul. Chang's breath came faster, and he gripped the edge of the bed, his knuckles white. As Teresa's whisper filled the room once more, "I have returned, to make you remember, and to make you pay," and then, with a final, chilling gaze, Teresa's figure faded, dissolving into the shadows of the night, leaving Chang and Evelyn alone in the stillness, haunted by the sound of her voice echoing in their ears. The room seemed darker, the shadows deeper, and though her form was gone, the air was thick with the weight of her presence. Chang slumped to his knees beside Evelyn, his pride shattered, his heart filled with a guilt that felt as endless as the night itself. He reached for her, his voice breaking. "Evelyn, what have I done?" But Evelyn's gaze was vacant, her eyes hollow, as though a part of her had followed their daughter into the shadows. And as the rain continued to beat against the window, they both knew that Teresa's ghost was not gone, that she lingered, watching, waiting. In the silence, Chang felt the crushing realization that he could not escape what he had done, that his daughter had come back to make him face the truth, and there was no turning away from it now. The storm raged on outside, but the true tempest lay within, the darkness pressing in on them, as Teresa's voice echoed in his mind, haunting him, promising retribution he could not outrun. Part 3. A Sinful Past. In the hollow stillness of the storm, Chang's mind was gripped by a series of haunting memories, vivid and merciless, clawing their way to the surface, as if Teresa's spirit itself had summoned them to exact her revenge. He closed his eyes, hoping the flood of recollections might be silenced, but each memory rose like a relentless wave, threatening to pull him under. He could still see her Teresa, so full of life, standing before him, her eyes sparkling with defiance and a hint of fear. She had looked so fragile in that moment, yet she'd gathered the strength to stand against him. "Father," she had pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, I love him. Nathaniel isn't wealthy, but he's kind. He's good to me. Isn't that what matters?" Her voice trembled with a raw, vulnerable hope that twisted something deep within Chang. Yet he had buried his pity beneath a stone-cold mask. He had scoffed, unable to understand how his own blood, his only daughter, could be so foolish. What did she know of honor, of the sacrifices required to uphold the family's reputation? "You disgrace us, Teresa," he had spat, his voice cutting, sharp as a blade. He remembered the tremor in her shoulders as she fought back tears, trying desperately to remain strong, but he had refused her every plea, every attempt to bridge the chasm he had forced between them. "If you abandon this family for that farmer, you will be dead to me. You will never set foot in this house again." She had left that night, face pale, her eyes hollowed with grief and betrayal, her heart torn between the man she loved and the family that had forsaken her. Chang had felt a small pang of regret as she disappeared into the night, but his pride was an insurmountable wall, and he turned his back on the pain, choosing instead to focus on his cherished reputation. But as he knelt there, trembling in the dim light of his room, he could feel the full weight of his choices crushing him like an iron shackle. Images of Teresa flashed through his mind, each one sharper, more haunting than the last. But he saw her laughter, the brightness in her eyes, the way she'd clung to his hand as a child, looking up at him with a trust and admiration he had taken for granted. He had loved her once, before his ambition and arrogance had poisoned that love, replacing it with cold demands and unyielding expectations. The night of her departure had been the last time he saw her alive. Within days, the terrible news had come. She had drowned in the river, a desperate accident, they said. The weight of the river, just as he had drowned her dreams under the weight of his judgment, had taken her life, leaving him with nothing but guilt and bitterness. He had barely managed to look Evelyn in the eye after that, burying himself further in his pride and refusing to speak of Teresa, convinced that his pain would fade. But it hadn't faded. Instead, it had festered, deepening the bitterness that had come to define him. He hadn't known the torment he'd placed upon his wife, who had mourned their daughter alone, in the dark, bearing her grief in silence. The resentment between them had grown, unspoken but palpable, casting a dark shadow over their lives. Evelyn had wept for Teresa when he had not, and he could see now, in the tear-streaked lines of her face, that his choices had shattered not only his daughter's life but also his wife's spirit. His chest tightened, and a tear slipped down his cheek unbidden. He could feel her there, even now, her presence hovering in the air, bitter and sorrowful. Teresa's spirit lingered, refusing him peace, refusing to let him turn away from what he had done. A low whisper drifted through the room, chilling him to his core. "You abandoned me, Father. You sent me to my death." Chang's heart raced as he looked around, his eyes wide with fear. Her voice was thick with sorrow, yet beneath it lay an unmistakable edge of malice. She was there, just beyond the reach of his sight, her presence lingering like a shadow that could not be dispelled. Every word echoed in his mind, her accusations carving deep into his soul. "Teresa," he murmured, barely able to choke out her name, as if finally acknowledging her could lessen his guilt. But the name felt foreign on his tongue, as though he had betrayed even her memory. I did not mean for this to happen. I only wanted what was best," but his excuses fell flat, sounding hollow and cowardly even to himself. He could feel her anger, her hurt, like a cold wind wrapping around him, pressing against his heart, forcing him to confront the truth. "Well, you were my father," her voice drifted to him again, filled with a mournful fury. "You were meant to protect me, to love me. But you cast me out, left me alone to face a world that had no place for me. And now you will suffer as I did. You will know what it means to be abandoned." Evelyn stirred beside him, her face pale, eyes wide with fear and sorrow as she clung to him. "Chang, please listen to her. She is hurt. She only wanted our love. She wanted a family who accepted her." The words twisted like a knife in his chest, and he pulled back, his body tense, his mind racing as he tried to summon a defense, something to shield himself from the truth that was bearing down upon him with relentless force. But there was nothing he could say. There was no justification, no explanation that could erase the pain he had inflicted on his own daughter, his own blood. "Teresa," he whispered, his voice breaking, the walls he had built crumbling around him. "I was wrong. I see that now. I was a fool." Her laughter drifted through the air, cold and bitter, as though she found his regret laughable, too little and far too late. The sound wrapped around him, pressing in on him, a haunting echo of the joy she had once brought into their lives, now twisted into something unrecognizable, something filled with spite and vengeance. "You cannot escape me, Father," she said, her voice dark and unforgiving. "Not until you understand the depth of my pain, not until you have felt the emptiness I endured because of you." And then, just as suddenly as she had come, her presence seemed to dissipate, leaving an empty silence that was more terrifying than her ghostly whispers. The room felt colder, the darkness more oppressive, pressing down on him from all sides. Chang's breath came in ragged gasps, and he looked at Evelyn, her tear-streaked face mirroring his own fear and despair. He could no longer deny it. His daughter's spirit had returned, her sorrow and rage binding her to the world she should have left behind, and it was his fault, his pride. His refusal to see beyond his own rigid ideals had condemned her to a life of suffering, a tragic end that he would now be forced to reckon with. Evelyn's hands trembled as she reached for him, her voice barely a whisper. "Chang, we must make amends. We must find a way to ease her pain." But he shook his head, unable to face her, unable to bear the weight of his shame. He had been her father, her protector, and he had failed her in the worst way. No words, no apologies could change what he had done. He was haunted, bound to a past he could never escape, condemned to relive his daughter's suffering for as long as her spirit lingered. As the night wore on, Chang could feel her presence in every shadow, her sorrow and rage a constant reminder of his sins. And he knew that he would not be free until he had made things right, until he had faced the ghost of his past and begged for her forgiveness, a forgiveness he feared might never come. He collapsed to his knees, his hands clutching at his heart, as the crushing weight of his guilt bore down upon him, his own sins reflected back at him in the darkness. And for the first time, Chang allowed himself to grieve, the sobs racking his body as he wept for the daughter he had lost, for the family he had broken, and for the man he had become. Part 4. Shadows in the Hall. The mansion lay cloaked in darkness, the chill of night seeping into every crevice as though the walls themselves had begun to absorb the malice and sorrow that lingered in the air. Chang had barely gathered his breath from the earlier encounter, his hand still shaking from the ghostly memory of Tiza's voice, when another sound, softer yet unmistakable, drifted through the halls. Evelyn stirred beside him, her hand clenching his as they both strained to listen, their hearts pounding with a familiar, creeping dread. Then, just when he thought his heart could bear no more, the sound grew clearer, closer. The faint voice of a child or boy, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, echoed through the vast, shadowed corridors of the mansion. Chang felt an icy grip tighten around his heart, his pulse racing as the boy's voice wove through the hall like a sinister lullaby, sweet and chilling, as though it came from a place beyond their world. Grandfather, the voice was impossibly soft, yet its innocence made it all the more haunting. The sound held a quiet sorrow that sent a cold tremor down Chang's spine, his mind racing to reconcile the impossible. He had never met his grandchild, Teresa's child, and yet here he was, his ghostly presence filling the silence with an accusation that was sharper, deeper than a blade. Evelyn's breath hitched, her fingers digging into his arm, a terrified whisper escaping her lips. "Chang, it's him, isn't it? Our grandson," she swallowed, her face ashen with fear and heartbreak, yet unable to tear her gaze away from the shadows that seemed to ripple and twist in the corners of the room. Chang tried to speak, but his throat was dry, his words caught in the cold grip of realization. He had severed not only his daughter's life, but his bloodline. The boy he had never met, the boy whose life he had denied before it even began, had returned to haunt him, carrying with him the weight of love and forgiveness Chang had so carelessly rejected. "Why didn't you want us, grandfather?" the voice called, soft and innocent, yet the words held a bitter edge, carrying a resentment Chang could feel seeping into his very bones. His hands trembled as he clutched Evelyn, his heart pounding, his mind racing to understand. But how could he explain, how could he justify the heartless choice he'd made? He had banished his daughter to a life of loneliness and suffering, condemning his grandson to grow up without a family, without a place in the world. I didn't know," Chang stammered, his voice hoarse, barely able to choke out the words. He wanted to believe it, to convince himself that he hadn't known the consequences of his actions, that he hadn't realized the destruction he had wrought. But he knew deep down that it was a lie, an illusion to ease the burden of his guilt. He had known, and he had chosen to turn away, to ignore the suffering of those who had depended on him. The boy's voice floated through the air again, colder now, a ghostly whisper that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. "She was alone, grandfather, alone. And so was I. Why didn't you love us?" The words tore through Chang's heart like a jagged knife, his chest tightening with the grief he had spent years burying, denying. He saw visions of a life he had never known, the boy laughing, running, reaching out for a grandfather who had abandoned him before he'd even taken his first breath. Each image was a painful reminder of the family he had sacrificed for his pride, the love he had thrown away in his blind pursuit of status and reputation. "I should have been there," Chang whispered, his voice breaking, barely able to hold back the tears that burned in his eyes. "I should have been there for you." For her, but the shadows only deepened, the boy's voice filling the silence with a soft, bitter laughter that seemed to echo through every corner of the mansion. The sound was chilling, its innocent melody twisted with an underlying sorrow that made Chang's heart ache with the guilt he could no longer escape. He could feel his grandson's presence lingering just beyond his sight, his small hand reaching out for the love he had been denied, the family he had never known. Evelyn clutched him tighter, her eyes glistening with tears, her voice barely a whisper. "Chang, our grandson, he was lost to us. Because of what we did." The weight of her words sank into him like a leaden stone, dragging him further into the abyss of his own making. He had severed the bonds of family, had cast away his own flesh and blood, and now he was forced to face the echoes of the love he had destroyed, the life he had denied his daughter and her child. "Grandfather," the voice called again, softer now, almost pleading, as though seeking an answer Chang could not give. "Why didn't you come for us?" Chang's breath caught in his throat, the sorrow in the boy's voice piercing him to his core. He wanted to speak, to find the words to mend the wounds he had inflicted, but there was nothing he could say. His pride had been a cruel master, driving him to forsake the very people who had loved him, who had depended on him. And now he was left with only regret, a hollow echo of the life he could have had, the family he could have loved. The boy's laughter faded into silence, leaving a chilling emptiness that settled over the room like a shroud. Chang's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing, his guilt consuming him as he realized the full extent of his sins. His daughter, his grandson, they had returned, not to haunt him, but to remind him of the love he had abandoned, the family he had forsaken. As the silence grew, Evelyn turned to him, her eyes filled with a sorrow he could barely comprehend. Chang, we must make this right. For her, for him. We must find a way to atone, but Chang could only stare into the darkness, his mind numb, his heart heavy with the weight of his own failures. He had destroyed his family, had cast aside the love that should have been his legacy, and now he was left with nothing but the echoes of his mistakes, the haunting whispers of those he had betrayed. The mansion fell silent once more, the darkness pressing in around them, a constant reminder of the family he had lost, the love he had squandered. Chang knew there would be no peace, no redemption, until he had faced his past, until he had begged for forgiveness from the souls he had wronged. He sank to his knees, his hands trembling, his voice a broken whisper, as he murmured into the empty silence, "Teresa, my grandson, please, forgive me." But there was no answer, only the cold, unyielding darkness that surrounded him, a chilling reminder of the life he had chosen, a life defined by pride, by arrogance, by a love he had refused to acknowledge until it was too late. And now he was left with nothing but regret, a hollow echo of the family he had lost, the love he had abandoned. Part 5. The Unforgiving Spirits. The nights in Chang's once peaceful mansion had grown colder, the walls seeming to pulse with a sinister energy, like the breath of something ancient and unspeakable. As the days crawled by, the air became thick with a creeping dread that seeped into every corner, every shadow. Chang barely slept now, his mind consumed by the shadows of his past, by the sorrow and vengeance that haunted his very steps. It began slowly at first, flickers of movement in the corner of his eye, whispers that dissolved into silence when he turned. But soon there was no mistaking their presence. Teresa's spectre appeared at the edge of his vision, her pale face floating through the shadows, her eyes holding a hollow darkness that pierced into his soul. She looked nothing like the vibrant young woman he remembered. Instead, she was a wraith, twisted by grief and betrayal, her delicate features distorted by the rage that had once been hidden beneath her gentle demeanor. And beside her, her son, a child Chang had never known, stood, a small, silent figure whose gaze seemed far older than his years. Evelyn too had begun to withdraw, her own spirit seemingly crushed under the weight of their daughter's vengeance. She would murmur to herself, praying in whispers, fingers twisting over her rosary beads, as though they could protect her from the creeping darkness that had invaded their home. Yet every prayer seemed only to anger the spirits, each word a futile play against the judgment they had returned to deliver. Chang had tried seeking help, desperation driving him to the village elders, priests, anyone who might offer salvation. But word of the hauntings had spread quickly, and the townspeople refused to come near the mansion. They would avert their gaze, crossing themselves or murmuring protective charms whenever Chang drew near. Some even spat on the ground when he passed, muttering curses beneath their breath. In their eyes he had become tainted, marked by the spirits he had wronged. And so he returned night after night to the chilling silence of his home, where shadows moved in unnatural patterns, where whispers of the dead filled the halls. One night, as a bitter storm howled outside, he awoke to the soft sound of footsteps echoing down the corridor, each step heavy with a slow, measured anger. He sat up, his heart pounding, his breath catching in his throat as he strained to listen, the hairs on his arms prickling as the footsteps drew closer, closer ... till they stopped just outside his bedroom door. For a moment, all was silent. Then came the soft, mournful voice of his daughter. "Father ... Why did you abandon me?" Teresa's voice drifted through the door, a haunting melody that seemed to carry the weight of years of pain and betrayal. She had loved him once, trusted him. Now, she was here to claim the justice he had denied her in life. His voice broke, a hoarse whisper as he struggled to respond. "Teresa ... my child, I am so sorry. But she did not answer him with forgiveness. Instead she appeared, the door swinging open without a sound as she floated into the room, her eyes dark as an endless void, staring into him with a coldness that seemed to freeze his very soul. Her face was a twisted mask of sorrow and wrath, her features flickering in and out of the shadows, as though she were caught between worlds, unable to fully return yet unable to leave. Behind her, her son's ghost emerged, a pale, solemn figure who moved with a slow, eerie grace, his small form a haunting echo of the life he had never been allowed to live. The boy's eyes, dark and unblinking, fixed on Chang, holding an expression of such bitterness that Chang could barely stand to meet his gaze. "Grandfather," the boy whispered, his voice soft yet seething with a cold rage that sent a shiver through Chang's bones. "Why did you leave us to suffer alone?" Chang's knees buckled, his legs giving way as he sank to the floor, his voice a broken, desperate play. I didn't understand. I thought I was protecting you, the family I never meant for you to be hurt." But the boy's gaze only grew darker, his small hands curling into fists as he took a step closer, his voice rising with a new intensity, a hollow echo that filled the room with a suffocating heaviness. "You left my mother to die. You left me without a chance, without a life. Because of you we are trapped in this darkness." Chang looked up at his grandson, his vision blurring with tears, his heart aching with a pain that seemed to tear him apart from within. "Please beg you, forgive me." But Teresa's voice cut through his play, sharp and filled with a fury that seemed to burn the very air around her. "Forgiveness," she spat, her words filled with a venom that chilled him to the core. "You cast me out, condemned me to a life of sorrow, all because of your pride. And now you ask for forgiveness as if words could erase the years of pain you inflicted." Her form shifted, growing darker, more twisted, her sorrow transforming into an unyielding rage that filled the room with an oppressive darkness. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows deepening as though the house itself had become an extension of her wrath, a prison of her making. Evelyn, pale and trembling, stepped forward, her voice choked with tears. "Teresa, please, we are sorry. We've regretted it every day since you left us." But the boy, standing beside his mother's spirit, looked at her with an expression so cold, so empty, that it silenced her plea. "Regret cannot bring back the dead, grandmother," he whispered, his voice soft yet filled with a bitterness that seemed to hang in the air like a poison. Chang felt the weight of his sins bearing down on him, pressing him into the floor, as though the spirits themselves were crushing him beneath the weight of their judgment. His breath came in short, panicked gasps, his mind racing with images of Teresa's life, of the joy he had denied her, the love he had so cruelly severed. He saw her crying, alone and broken, saw the life she had struggled to build only to be cast aside, abandoned by the family she had loved. "Teresa," he whispered, his voice trembling, "I am so sorry. I was a fool. My pride was worth nothing. It only took away what mattered most, my family, my only daughter." But Teresa's gaze remained cold, unforgiving, her sorrow too deep, her pain too great for mere words to heal. Her form flickered, growing dimmer, yet her presence seemed to grow stronger, filling the room with a chill that sank deep into his bones. "You will live with this guilt, father," she murmured, her voice a low, haunting whisper. "For every night you denied me, every tear you caused, you will feel this pain. And when you are alone, when all that remains is the silence of your own heart, you will remember what you did. There will be no peace for you, not now, not ever." As she spoke, her son's spirit stepped forward, his eyes locked onto Chang's, his voice an echo of his mother's rage. "You will be haunted by us, grandfather. We will linger in these walls, in every shadow, until your soul is as broken as ours." The two spirits faded into the darkness, their forms dissolving into the shadows, but their presence remained, an unyielding weight that pressed upon the house, upon Chang's heart. He knew, with a certainty that froze him to his core, that they would never truly leave. They would be there, night after night, a constant reminder of the lives he had destroyed, the love he had cast aside. And so Chang sat, alone in the silence, his heart heavy with the weight of his sins, knowing that his punishment had only just begun. The spirits would return, filling his nights with their cold, relentless judgment, their sorrow and rage echoing through the empty halls. And there, in the darkness of his own making, he would be left to face his greatest fear, the truth of the life he had thrown away. Part 6. descent into madness. Chang's descent was gradual, creeping into the crevices of his mind, stealing his sleep and leaving him hollow-eyed, haunted by the specters he could neither escape nor ignore. The once commanding village chief respected, even feared, for his iron will and ruthless pride was unraveling, thread by trembling thread. The nights were the worst, stretching out endlessly, each one bringing new torments as shadows clawed their way into his consciousness. Chang's once stately mansion, a symbol of his power and stature, had transformed into a labyrinth of horror. Each hallway, each closed door, every darkened corner seemed to pulse with the presence of the spirits he had wronged. The faces of his daughter and her son floated just beyond the edge of his vision, disappearing the moment he looked toward them, but never leaving his mind. At first, it was only in the dead of night that he heard them, the faint whispers brushing against his ears like an icy wind, calling his name with voices tinged with sadness and accusation. "Father." Teresa's voice would echo, fragile and despairing, the sound twisting through his mind, filling him with a paralyzing dread. Sometimes he could even hear the soft laughter of the boy he had never known, a chilling reminder of the life that had been lost because of his unforgiving pride. But soon they began to haunt him even in the daylight. Shadows seemed to follow him, lingering just at the edge of his vision, slipping away when he tried to confront them. His days, once filled with purpose and control, had become a waking nightmare. He could no longer distinguish between reality and illusion, his once sharp mind now clouded by a constant, gnawing fear. His hand shook as he reached for his tea, his eyes darting to each corner, each flicker of movement, waiting for the apparitions that would surely come. Chang tried to ignore it, to shut out the whispers, to silence the echoes of his past mistakes. But the ghosts of his family were relentless, persistent as they crept deeper into his mind, turning every thought into a reminder of his sins. His heart pounded each time he heard that mournful, accusatory father uttered in the darkness, each syllable piercing his soul. Desperation clawed at him as he realized he could no longer find solace in anything he once knew. He sought help again, this time more frantically, willing to beg, to bribe, to plead with anyone who would listen. But the villagers would not approach him. They had heard of his torment, and their fear had turned to contempt. Some would mutter curses as he passed, others would turn their backs, as though to protect themselves from his cursed existence. They whispered that the spirits of his daughter and grandson had come for revenge, that his punishment was only just beginning. So night after night, Chang would sit alone in his study, clutching a tattered photograph of Tirza, his hands trembling as he traced the edges of her face. The picture was old, worn from years of handling, but it was the last connection he had to the daughter he had so callously cast aside. He could almost hear her laughter in the silence, the echo of a joy he had once destroyed in the name of his pride. One night, as the storm raged outside, Chang's fear turned to sheer terror. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. And then, slowly, the temperature dropped, a biting cold settling over the room that sank deep into his bones. He could see his breath clouding in the air, and the shadows began to gather, pulling together, growing darker, until they took the shape of his daughter. Teresa's ghostly figure stood before him, her once bright eyes now dark and hollow, her face a twisted mask of sorrow and rage. She stared at him in silence, her gaze piercing, unyielding, filled with an accusation that needed no words. Behind her, the small figure of her son appeared, his innocent face marred by a bitterness no child should ever possess. Chang fell to his knees, his voice a choked whisper. "Teresa ... please ... forgive me. I ... I was wrong. I didn't know ... I didn't realize." But Teresa's face remained cold, her expression unchanging. "You knew, father. You knew, and you chose your pride over your own family." Her voice was barely more than a whisper, yet it filled the room, a low, mournful wail that seemed to resonate within him, stirring up memories he had buried long ago. I thought I was protecting our family's name," Chang stammered, his voice breaking. But his words felt hollow, empty, even to him. How could he justify the years of suffering he had inflicted, the pain he had caused his only daughter? The boy stepped forward, his eyes dark with a sorrow too heavy for his young face. "You took everything from us, grandfather," he whispered, his voice soft but piercing. "Because of you, I never knew a mother's love, a family's warmth. You left us to suffer in silence, to die alone." Chang felt a weight settle over him, pressing down on his shoulders, his heart, as though the ghosts themselves were reaching into him, squeezing the life from his soul. His chest tightened and he struggled to breathe, the air thick with despair, with regret. He realized then that there was no escape, no redemption for life so marred by cruelty and pride. Every night their visits became more intense, more relentless, each encounter chipping away at his sanity, eroding what little strength he had left. His mind, once sharp and calculating, was now frayed, unraveling under the weight of his guilt. He could feel himself slipping, his thoughts scattering, unable to grasp onto reality as the ghosts of his past closed in around him. Evelyn watched him with a sorrowful gaze, her own spirit crushed by the horror that had consumed their lives. She would reach for him, try to offer comfort, but her touch only reminded him of all that he had lost. He could see the despair in her eyes, knew that she, too, blamed him, though she never said it aloud. She had loved Teresa, had wanted to accept her, but Chang's pride had left no room for compassion. Now, as the days blurred into one endless nightmarish haze, Chang felt the last threads of his mind snapping, his once proud resolve crumbling. He would sit in the darkened corners of the mansion, muttering to himself, his fingers clutching at his hair, his eyes wide and wild as he stared into the shadows, waiting for the faces that would come, that would haunt him until his dying breath. "I'm sorry, ... I'm sorry," he would whisper over and over, but there was no one left to hear, no one left to forgive him. The spirits had returned, not to grant him peace, but to pull him into the same darkness they had suffered, to leave him broken, shattered, until he was nothing more than a hollow shell. And as the haunting continued, as the mansion filled with the whispers of the dead, Chang's voice grew weaker, his pleas quieter, until all that remained was a faint, trembling echo in the dark, a man who had lost everything, not by fate but by his own hand. Part 7. The Final Confrontation. Chang stumbled through the empty hallways of his once proud mansion, his every step heavy, as if weighed down by chains of guilt and regret. Shadows clung to the walls, growing darker, thicker, as he neared his study, the room where he had once made all his grand decisions, where he had ruled over his family with pride and authority. But tonight it felt smaller, suffocating, and there was no sense of security within these walls. The air was thick and cold, pressing against his lungs, with a biting chill that made each breath ragged and shallow. As he reached the doorway, he saw them, the pale, ethereal figures of his daughter Teresa and his grandson, their forms hazy yet unmistakably present, like ghostly reflections in a cracked mirror. Teresa stood tall and silent, her once kind eyes now cold and hollow, holding an expression of deep sorrow mixed with righteous anger. Her son stood beside her, his small, fragile frame seeming to tremble with both fear and a quiet accusation. In his young eyes was a wisdom too cruel for a child, a gaze that spoke of suffering far beyond his years. For a long moment, Chang could do nothing but stare, paralyzed by the haunting sight before him. His heart hammered against his chest, a wild, erratic beat that echoed the panic rising in his throat. His mouth went dry, his hands trembled, and he felt a chill crawl down his spine. This was not the daughter he remembered, the lively, spirited girl who once laughed and danced through these halls. This was something different, something darker, something that had been shaped and twisted by the agony he had caused. Father Teresa's voice was a low, mournful whisper, cutting through the silence like a blade. She took a step forward, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that made him flinch. Her face was pale, almost translucent, yet her eyes blazed with an unnatural fire, a sorrow so deep it seemed to bleed into the very air around her. "Do you know what you have done?" Chang opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His throat felt as though it had closed, strangled by an invisible hand of remorse. He wanted to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but the words felt hollow, meaningless. How could he ask for redemption when he had torn her life apart, condemned her to a fate worse than death? Teresa's gaze hardened, her expression shifting from sorrow to something far more sinister. "You cast me out," she continued, her voice trembling with a bitterness he had never heard before. "Your pride, your obsession with honor and status, those things meant more to you than I ever did." Chang shook his head, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Teresa, I thought I was doing what was best for our family. For you, best for me." Teresa's laugh was bitter, a hollow sound that echoed through the room, sending chills down his spine. "You abandoned me, father. You left me to suffer, to die alone? And for what? For your name? For the empty respect of strangers?" Her words cut into him like knives, each accusation twisting deeper into his heart, tearing open wounds he had tried so hard to ignore. He had justified his actions to himself for so long, convinced himself that he had made the right choices. But now, faced with the broken spirit of his daughter, he could no longer deny the truth. He had destroyed her, cast her aside like she was nothing more than a stain on his reputation. As he struggled to find his voice, the boy stepped forward, his small figure emanating a chilling presence that seemed to weigh down the very air. His eyes met Chang's, and in them Chang saw not only sorrow but a quiet, seething anger, a fury buried beneath layers of heartbreak. "Grandfather," the boy's voice was soft, yet it filled the room, resonating with an unnatural clarity. "You took away my mother. You took away the life I could have had. Because of you, I grew up in darkness, without warmth, without love." Chang's chest tightened, a wave of guilt washing over him so strong it nearly brought him to his knees. He had never met this boy in life, yet here he was, standing before him, a reminder of everything he had lost, everything he had sacrificed for the sake of his own ego. I didn't know," Chang whispered, his voice barely audible. I thought I was protecting us." The boy's gaze remained unyielding, piercing through his feeble excuses. "Protecting us," he echoed, his tone cold and disbelieving. "You destroyed us, grandfather. You turned your back on us, left us to suffer, to die alone, all because we didn't fit into the perfect picture you wanted to paint." Chang felt a lump rise in his throat, his vision blurring as tears filled his eyes. He had spent so many years building walls around his heart, hiding behind a facade of strength and authority. But now, those walls were crumbling, shattered by the weight of his sins. He had been wrong, so terribly, horribly wrong. And there was no way to undo the pain he had caused, no way to bring back the lives he had taken. Teresa stepped closer, her voice softening, yet laced with a sorrow that cut deeper than any anger ever could. "Do you understand now, Father?" she asked, her gaze filled with a haunting sadness. "Do you see what you have done?" Chang nodded, his voice breaking as he whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," but his apologies felt empty, his regret a hollow echo that could never fill the void he had created. He had shattered their lives, condemned his own blood to a life of suffering and despair, all for the sake of a pride that now felt meaningless, insignificant. Teresa's expression softened, but there was no forgiveness in her gaze. Only a quiet, resigned sadness, as if she had long since given up hope of finding peace. She reached out, her ghostly hand brushing against his cheek, and he felt a cold, tingling sensation spread through his skin, a reminder of the warmth he would never feel again. "We were your family, Father," she whispered, her voice fading as her figure began to dissolve into the shadows. "But you chose your pride over us, and now you will live with that choice for the rest of your days." As her figure disappeared, Chang felt a crushing weight settle over him, a suffocating despair that wrapped around his heart like a vice. The room grew darker, the shadows closing in, and he was left alone, surrounded by the echoes of his own guilt, the silent reminders of the lives he had destroyed. He sank to the floor, his body trembling, his heart heavy with a sorrow that would never fade. He had lost everything, his family, his honor, his soul. And in that empty, desolate room he realized that there was no redemption, no forgiveness for the sins he had committed. He was a broken man, a hollow shell, haunted by the ghosts of his past, condemned to live with the weight of his choices, the shadows of his mistakes. And as the silence settled over him, he knew that this was his punishment, his eternal penance, a life of regret, a soul tormented by the memories of the family he had cast aside. Part 8. A deadly decision. Chang sat alone in his dimly lit study, the room suffused with an eerie stillness that seemed to press down on him from every corner. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second punctuating the silence, drawing him closer to a decision he had resisted but now embraced as inevitable. The haunting, empty gaze of his daughter and grandson lingered in his mind, their ghostly images replaying over and over in his thoughts. No amount of remorse or whispered apologies had softened their judgment, and Chang knew with chilling certainty that forgiveness would never come. The house felt colder than ever, as though the very walls had been leached of life, holding only memories twisted by his pride and cruelty. There were no voices now, no shadows moving in his peripheral vision. The spirits had left him, perhaps only to let him steep in his regret, leaving him alone in a silence so deep it was deafening. His hand trembled as he uncorked a small vial, a thin stream of black liquid inside glistening in the candlelight. It was poison, the kind he had once heard of, quick, silent, and unforgiving. He watched the liquid for a moment, its darkness reflecting the despair that had taken root in his heart, a fitting end for a man who had allowed his own darkness to consume the lives of those he should have cherished. Chang's mind wandered back to his last memory of Teresa, standing in tears as he ordered her away from the family home. He had felt so righteous then, so certain that he was preserving the family's honor by severing ties with her. And yet, in the face of that certainty, he had destroyed everything that truly mattered. Now, the irony weighed on him heavily. The honor he had prized above all was nothing but an illusion, and his family, the people he had claimed to protect, were gone. Teresa, he whispered, his voice thick with sorrow, the name almost foreign on his lips. It was as if he had forgotten how to speak her name with anything but disdain. Now it was filled with yearning and regret, the syllables carrying the weight of every lost moment, every word left unsaid. Please, forgive me. In his mind, he saw her face, soft, young, hopeful, and the look of betrayal that had replaced her innocence when he had cast her aside. He thought of her son, the grandson he would never know, whose life had ended without the chance to begin. The boy's voice, so hauntingly accusatory, echoed in his ears. You took everything from us. A tear slipped down Chang's cheek as he brought the vial to his lips. He took a deep, shuddering breath, inhaling the sharp, acrid scent of the poison. He closed his eyes, imagining that perhaps, in the next life, he might find Teresa and her son, and they would understand his remorse. Perhaps they might even forgive him. He swallowed the poison, the liquid burning its way down his throat like a trail of fire. He dropped the vial, his body convulsing as the poison took hold, sending waves of icy pain through his veins. His vision blurred, and the room seemed to tilt and spin around him, shadows flickering at the edge of his sight. But instead of peace, an even deeper darkness began to seep into the room, colder and more malevolent than anything he had felt before. He tried to steady his gaze, but the shadows gathered, solidifying into shapes into the figures of his daughter and grandson, standing before him with an intensity that sent terror rushing through his dying heart. Teresa's face was etched with an expression of profound sorrow, but her eyes held a look of unyielding judgment. Beside her, the boy looked on, his small figure exuding an unsettling presence that seemed to fill the room with a sense of impending doom. They watched him, silent and unmoved, as he sank to the floor, his life slipping away with each shallow breath. Teresa, he gasped, his voice a mere whisper, barely audible in the thick, oppressive silence. I did this for you, so you would know. I regret, but there was no compassion in her gaze, no softening in her stance. Her eyes remained cold, as if she saw through his final act as nothing more than a desperate attempt to escape the consequences he had created. In his final moments, a chilling realization dawned upon him. He had expected his death to be a release, a way to join his family, to end his suffering by paying the ultimate price. But now, as his vision faded, he understood the depth of his error. Death would not grant him peace. The darkness that awaited him was not a path to reunion, but a descent into the very despair he had inflicted upon them. The room grew darker still, the shadows tightening around him, pressing against his chest, his lungs suffocating him. His heart beat weaker, slower, until it was barely a faint echo, a reminder of the life he had wasted. Teresa's face was the last thing he saw as his world plunged into nothingness, her gaze unwavering, condemning him to the fate he had brought upon himself. As his consciousness faded, a deep, unending void awaited him, one that held no light, no warmth, no forgiveness, only the eternal, inescapable torment of his own choices. And in that final moment, as he slipped into oblivion, he understood the full weight of his sins, realizing too late that he would carry them forever in the dark eternity that awaited him. Part 9. Eternal Reunion. When Chang opened his eyes, he was no longer in his grand, cold mansion, but in a vast, empty landscape shrouded in shadows, where an ominous mist hung in the air, twisting and curling with a life of its own. The silence was deafening, an unnatural quiet that seemed to press against his ears, filling him with a dread that sank into his bones. His surroundings were bleak, a void where time and space held no meaning, where light struggled to pierce the heavy darkness. He was alone, or so he thought. From within the mist, a figure began to emerge, faint at first, growing clearer with each second. As she took form, Chang's heart twisted in his chest, filling with a strange mix of sorrow and fear. It was Teresa, his daughter, her face pale and expressionless, her gaze piercing, unwavering. Her eyes held a sadness so profound it was almost tangible, pressing down on him like a crushing weight. Beside her stood a small child, a boy, her son Chang's grandson, who looked at him with the same solemn intensity. Teresa Chang's voice was a faint, trembling whisper, carrying all the regret he had refused to feel in life. Yet here, in this desolate realm, his remorse was a bitter weight, a noose tightening around his soul. The words tumbled out in broken, fragmented pleas. I am sorry. For everything. For the pain. For the pride that blinded me. Teresa remained silent, her gaze unreadable, and Chang felt the chill ripple through him. Her expression was devoid of forgiveness, stripped of any warmth or solace. The young boy beside her, his grandson, a child he had never met in life, looked at him with innocent eyes that held an inexplicable sorrow, as if even in death, the child understood the cruel injustice that had led him here. Chang's knees weakened, and he collapsed, his heart heavy with an anguish he had long denied. Please, tell me you can forgive me, he whispered, his voice barely a breath, breaking under the weight of his remorse. I was wrong. I was so wrong. A flicker of something stirred in Teresa's eyes, pain, perhaps, or the faintest glimmer of acknowledgement. But there was no forgiveness, no absolution. Her silence became a piercing, unbearable truth, the emptiness between them a chasm that words could never bridge. The air around them began to thicken, dark tendrils of mist curling around Chang's ankles, pulling him deeper into the cold abyss. He tried to resist, but the mist tightened, constricting him, a relentless force that seemed to punish him with every breath. Each moment was an eternity, each second stretching into an unending torment. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was trapped here, bound to this desolate place, forever linked to the family he had wronged. In life, he had believed death would bring freedom, a final escape from the consequences of his pride. But here, in this eternal realm, he was bound by his sins, tethered to the ghosts of the family he had cast aside. His suffering would be endless, his spirit condemned to wander alongside Teresa and her son, forever haunted by the love he had denied, the family he had destroyed. Chang reached out a trembling hand, desperate to touch his daughter, to feel some semblance of connection, but she remained just out of reach, a ghostly figure caught between forgiveness and judgment. The boy, his grandson, watched him with unblinking eyes, an innocent witness to the price of Chang's pride. The silence grew, thickening around them, heavy and unbreakable, until it became a prison of its own. Chang felt the weight of his actions settle over him, an unbearable burden he could not cast aside. There would be no release, no peace, only the endless awareness of the life he had wasted, the love he had spurned. His spirit would remain here, suspended in a realm beyond redemption. His only companions, the silent figures of his daughter and grandson, whose sorrow and loss would mirror his own regret for all eternity. In the end, Chang's final punishment was not fire or darkness, but the haunting presence of his family, an eternal reminder of the love he had sacrificed, the lives he had shattered, and the pride that had led him to his downfall. Forever bound to them, he would carry the weight of his sins, a ghost among ghosts, in a place where forgiveness would never find him.